Thank you for having me. Hello, adrenaline. Here it is. Okay. So it's been such a wonderful day so far, and when we start planning the conference and thinking about it, what I knew was that Dr. Gopnik, who is such an amazing researcher and articulator, she communicates so amazingly these concepts, and that she was going to talk about are babies more conscious than we are. And I thought, okay, if I'm the bookend to this powerful woman, what can we think about together to end our day? And I thought about, what did Magda teach us? Because I think the answer is yes. And I think that Dr. Gopnik answered that question this morning, that yes, indeed, infants are more conscious than we are. And I loved that image of, being in Paris, in love, 3 espressos and a pack of cigarettes. And that's how babies experience life. And so, so what does that mean for us? If they're perceiving things we're not perceiving, how can we possibly take care of them? And lucky for us, Magda Gerber gave us some wonderful guidance because she also understood that babies are more conscious than we are. So I started thinking about the senses of the infant and what is the sensible approach for us as adults. So I want to share a little bit about that. So I wanted to consider what it means for us when infants have such profoundly keen senses and experiences, and they understand at such a visceral level how we are feeling, better than we may know ourselves. So I'm imagining, if you're here, that you've probably had some profound experiences with babies, and you know that they hear airplanes before we do, right? They notice minuscule birds in the sky. They have this inner wisdom that tells them to crawl downstairs head first, because it's safer for them, even though it's a little uncomfortable for adults who aren't aware of that. So what's the sensible thing for us to do? So hence my title, which they made me think of 6 months ago before I knew what I wanted to say to you. And I'm not actually a big fan of Jane Austen, no offense to anyone who is, but I do want to thank her for her clever title, and I changed it a little bit, added an S. So senses and sensibilities is the question. I want to explore the sensory world of the infant, or the adult experience of the sensory world of the infant, and how we as grown-ups can sensibly respond. What do I mean by sensible? Well, let me give an example of a not sensible response. Many years ago, the scientists made this discovery that infants pay attention to contrasts, that they notice the edges and the sharp contrasts in things. So what came after that discovery? Black and white everything for babies, right? We had black and white mobiles, black and white books, black and white sheets and cribs. When in fact, the message of the research was that babies already were noticing the contrasts, and we didn't have to make it more obvious for them. So that's a non-sensible approach. Okay, so it was about 18 years ago, because I remember my niece being bombarded with black and white, and she just turned 18. So I think Magda offered us all kinds of insight into how to be sensible with infants, and I'm going to share some lessons. She offered us guidance in tuning into babies. She taught us how to observe without expectations, and she always told us to give babies time, and more time. And I'll discuss each of these today. And I also think there was always this lesson to be humble, that we don't really know what's going on inside the baby, and I think Magda was keenly aware of that. Because you're here, I feel like I can assume that you've had some wonderful experiences with infants, and to some degree you're fascinated by infants. So I'm going to share a few personal moments with my own children, who are now 7 and 9, which made me feel a sense of awe. So as I'm talking, you may well be reflecting on your own children or children you've cared for. I grew up here in Los Angeles, but I am raising my children on the Gulf Coast in Florida, and I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but the sand on our beach is as white as snow and as fine as sugar, so we call it sugar sand. And my 16-month-old daughter was on the beach, and she's very fast. As soon as she figured out how to walk, she learned to run, and she grabbed a little handful of sand and had it in her hand, and she was running by, and I was just sitting watching the children, which was nice, a nice moment for a mommy, and she ran by me, and she placed her little handful of sand down next to me, and it just was one of those moments I just happened to be aware of because her little fingerprints were in it. Maybe 30 seconds later, a minute later, she raced by and she grabbed it. She didn't even look. She knew exactly where it was, and she went and she put it somewhere else. And I just felt this sense of awe that I still feel, that she was so aware, without trying, without concentrating, without making a map, of where she'd put a handful of white sugar sand on a white sugar sand beach. So I'm sure you've had, and when we have a moment of observation like that, there's this feeling of, how many things have I missed? You know, how many other moments are going on that I didn't see? Another was with my son, who's now 9, my son Augustine, who as an infant, when we rode in the car, which babies have to do sometimes, he would hum the tone of the engine. And when I would change the gear, he would change the tone of his hum to go along with the engine. He was also keenly aware of changes in elevation. So he'd tell, as he got older and was old enough to talk, he would say, "We're going up, Mommy, going up, we're going down." And that we lived in Marin County, which is very hilly, but when he was 2, we moved to Florida, which is not so hilly. And there, the elevation changes are much more subtle, and even there, he would notice. Another moment, one more moment with him was when he was 6 months old. He was sitting, being held, not exactly sitting. Don't tell anyone I said that. And he was looking into a little water feature in my parents' backyard, and we dropped a pebble into the water. And the pebble dropping was not some intention like we're going to entertain this baby. It just, the pebble was going into the water, and he laughed like he was watching a comedy show. And every time a pebble went into the water, he just had this big belly laugh and just had this incredible experience of that moment. So those kinds of moments leave me with a sense of awe. And I'm sure all of you have had moments in your memories when a child's awareness or insight astonished you. And really, for you to have those moments is an extraordinary feat, because we're quite powerful in their lives. And for us to be amazed and humbled by them is quite extraordinary. And Magda helped many of us to be able to see infants with new eyes, and to be able to be humbled by them, and to notice their extraordinary capacities, and to respond appropriately. So I'd like to share with you, oh yeah, that was supposed to be showing already. Okay, so this is my daughter Halcyon, the one who grabbed the sand. She's 7 now. And this is Augustine at 16 months having a little exploration. So we were introduced to the notion this morning of the scientist in this crib and the child as researcher. So this is a moment of research for Gus. So I'm going to tell you what's wrong with this video and why it's not going to be on your DVD. He's in a high chair, which we didn't have a tray on it. We used this when we were having family meals, but he did have a little table right behind there that we had many family meals at, and he had many meals at his tiny table. So he also is having this meal with his free-form daddy, who was really kind of okay with a lot of exploration and still is. So some people might say, playing with spilled milk makes me uncomfortable. So I do apologize for that too. But what I want you to notice is very specific. So I'm actually going to tell you, since you're only going to watch this once, and I had to watch a couple times to get it, is Gus is swishing his little silver cup back and forth, and he probably accidentally bumps the china plate. It makes a tone. Swishing it back and forth, it bumps the glass plate, and he notices there's a different tone. And he very systematically repeats his experiment. So if we had a chance to watch this a few times, I'd let you identify that for yourself, but I wanted to make sure it didn't get missed. He got it to repeat, and then he moved on. He's like, and so like any scientist, is it repeatable? Is a big part of scientific study. Yes, it is repeatable. He takes it in. Now it's time to play with the spilled milk, which we won't watch. So another way that infants have this incredible sensory capacity is that when their senses are overwhelmed, they can turn them off for a while. So to a degree, then this is how they protect themselves. So when a baby or a young child, when they look away, when they fall asleep, sometimes they cry, we need to trust them. They are showing us that they've had enough and they're taking a break. So when you're engaging with that infant and they turn their head, instead of following them around, we respect the fact that they've chosen to disengage for a moment. So another example from my family, I feel like Rye is my place where I get to talk about my family. I do a lot of training where I have to act a lot more professional. So we live in the South, and when in Rome, we do as the Romans do, right? So I'm raising a son in the South who has become fascinated with NASCAR. And so for his 7th birthday, we packed up the family and we drove to Talladega, Alabama, and we took a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old to the NASCAR race. People were horrified. I bought the headphones, to protect our ears ahead of time. So this is 7-year-old Gus on his birthday at Talladega, enjoying the extreme sensory input. He's listening to his favorite driver on the headphones and watching and cheering. In the same exact moment, the loudest sporting event in the world, this is his sister. It was too much. You can't see my hand pressed on her ear, but it is. But that's how she handled Talladega. So did I jostle her awake and tell her she was missing the time of her life? Absolutely not. She said to me, because both of them are aware that I asked their permission to tell stories about them today, and she said to me, "How did you stand up and cheer?" Because those are my legs. I said, "Honey, I didn't stand up and cheer when you were asleep in my lap." She said, "Oh, thank you." Okay, so they can turn it off, and we need to be able to support and respect that. And we also need to be able to, if there's too much stimulation, find ways to minimize that for them. They're learning to self-regulate. Those of you who heard Polly today, she talked a lot about that. And it's a lifetime process, and it comes easier to some than others. And so again, my 9-year-old has very intense emotions, and he used to blow up and get out of control. Does anyone know a child with intense emotions every once in a while blows up? Or maybe you yourself know that feeling, right? And but he's learned some strategies, and when he's overstimulated or feeling like he's going to get out of control, he removes himself from the situation and he retreats and he goes silent, which he says, don't talk, he's identified ahead of time. Talking to me is, I can't talk when I feel this way, but I can talk later. And for him, when we're home, the retreat is bed. That's where he goes. He loves his bed. And recently, we were painting their bedroom, and everything was taken out. And he had a moment of agitation, which was related to his bedroom being dismantled. And he had his sanctuary was tampered with. His time to go there, his space to go to, were messed with. And he blew, which he hadn't done in quite a while in the way that he did. And so, I think many of us might be able to relate to this feeling that when our safe place isn't there or accessible, it's much harder to regulate and to come back to being comfortable. So for babies, a big part of that safe place is the people they have close relationships with. So my daughter can be in this intensely overwhelming environment as a 4-year-old and go to sleep on my lap. So to create this safe place for them, a big part of that is that we tune into them, we attune to them, we could become connected with them. And it's almost subconscious, and where we're viscerally responding to each other. So here's an image, courtesy of Diana Suskind, of Magda tuning in. She taught us a lot about connecting with babies and learning from them and following their leads. And when I was doing my RIE training in the practicum period, you are the demonstrator in the RIE parent-infant guidance classes. And so the babies in my class were finally old enough for snack, and I was just about jumping out of my skin that I was finally going to get to do the famous RIE snack. And I have to disclose, Deborah mentioned that I have a background in Montessori, so I was simultaneously doing Montessori training, which was not easy on the mind. And I'm a very left-wing Montessorian, just in case you're wondering. So, but I did my master's thesis comparing Gerber, Pickler, and Montessori. So there's a big emphasis in Montessori on formalized movement and presentations. And so I did the snack, and I thought it went all right. And when you sit down with your facilitator after the class is over and you talk about how your demonstration went. And so I was lucky enough to have Magda be my facilitator, and we sat down and we talked about various parts of the class, and we got to the snack, and she said, "You paid more attention to the ritual than to the children." And she was absolutely right. I was so concerned with pouring perfectly and showing them what a good pourer I was that I didn't notice what I needed to notice from their cues and their cues to me. I think she helped many, I know she helped many over the years who had a hard time getting to this place of paying more attention to children. She famously told us that it's better to have 100% attention 50% of the time than 50% of the attention 100% of the time, which is so much easier to say than do. But babies know. They know when we're paying attention and giving full attention, and Magda would use that term, full attention, and they know when we're distracted. And they know better than we do. They can tell. She helped people so kindly and gently in the parent-infant guidance classes, supporting their instinctive responses while calmly helping them to regulate their emotions in her presence. And she would say to distressed mothers of distressed infants, "What would you do if you were home right now?" And often the mothers would say, I would pick her up, I would walk around with her, and Magda would say, "Why don't you? Why don't you do that?" And give them permission to do what felt comfortable. And she would support the mother's attunement with her child by attuning with the mother, modeling that attunement in a very gentle way. And I have to disclose that I am borrowing heavily at this moment from Ruth Ann Hammond's article, RIE and Neuroscience, in which she connects new neuroscience research to Magda's teachings. And this is going to appear in the expanded edition of the RIE manual, which is under construction, and will hopefully be available by the end of the year. So attunement is what happens when an infant and a primary adult, let's say the mother, just to make it easy, connect with each other and read each other and respond to each other in a subliminal way. Infants and mothers have have been called proto-conversations, where they are responding back and forth to each other. The mother has a very special role in that she helps the baby regulate. If the baby seems overstimulated, the sensitive mother will support the baby's withdrawal from interaction. If the baby seems to actively seek engagement, the mother will smile or coo or touch and help regulate the arousal. In the first few years of life, the role of the external or co-regulator is very important to the baby's healthy development. The adult both leads and follows based on feedback from the infant. Infants depend on their co-regulator. So I use the mother as the example, but if you're a caregiver in a child care setting, you also become a co-regulator. And we do it, you do it when you're holding a distressed baby and you slow your own breathing down, and that helps the baby slow the breathing down. When you breathe softly into their ear and start to model for them that what it feels like to calm down. You're co-regulating. In this book, it's actually about ADD, which I recently learned is in my family. It's called Scattered, and it's by Gabor Mate. And he talks about attunement. And I want to share a little bit. I'm not actually going to talk about ADD. It just happened to be part of the book. What he was saying about attunement. He said, attunement does not, this is a quote, does not mean mechanically imitating the infant. It cannot be simulated, even with the best of goodwill. As we all know, there are differences between a real smile and a staged smile. The muscles of smiling are exactly the same in each case, but the signals that set the smile muscles to work do not come from the same place in the brain. So I want to tell you another sort of interesting thing about attunement that some of you in the field may be familiar with, which is the still face experiment or the flat face experiment. Who's familiar with the still face experiment? Okay, a bunch of you, but not everyone, so I'm going to describe it. This experiment, it was developed by Dr. Ed Tronick in Massachusetts, and I'm not going to play it, because it's so unwry that we couldn't even sit in here and watch it. But it is fascinating. And if you want to see it, if you type still face experiment into YouTube, several different versions of it will come up. So in this experiment, the mother and the baby are in a room gazing at each other, and the mother has been instructed to engage with the baby and tune in with the baby and reciprocate with the baby. So the mother, and so this is what makes it not right. The baby is often strapped into a chair facing the mother. So they play and they talk and they coo to each other and they smile. And after 2 minutes, the mother is instructed to turn away. And when she turns back, she has no facial expression, and she does not respond to the baby for 2 minutes. And it feels like 2 hours when you're watching. So these babies who have a lot of skills and a lot of experience with attunement try all these techniques. They coo, they laugh, they do dimply smiles, they reach out, then they start a little bit more anxious attempts to reach out to her. Sometimes they point to see if they can get her attention. Will you share attention with me and look at something? They might start to arch, buck, screech, cry, some get hiccups. So they become very distressed within 2 minutes from not having response from their mother. So there was this other version of this experiment called the double play experiment, where they put the mother was not in the same room with the baby, but she's on a live feed video. So they're facing each other. They're each looking at video, live feed, and they do the same thing. She coos, she smiles, they laugh, they look at each other, and the baby engages with the mama on this live feed video. Then they double play it. They loop it back so it's no longer live, and they play it to the baby. The babies became just as distressed as when the mother didn't respond, because they're so aware that it's not real. There's no such thing as interactive TV. It doesn't exist. So Dr. Dan Siegel at UCLA, child psychiatrist, wrote about this double play experiment. He said, they still become as profoundly distressed as infants do in the classic flat face experiments, in which mother in person gives no facial emotional response to their infant's bid for attunement. So when they play the double play, it's not, there's no contingency. It's not related. That when the infant coos, the mother doesn't respond. So that attunement is really essential. And the babies know the difference. They know. Their senses inform them when we are being authentic, and they themselves are naturally authentic. Magda encouraged us to support the development of authenticity and to not send scrambling signals like, smile for me even though you're sad, or distracting a child who's missing her mother with silly antics. Instead, she would ask us to acknowledge the feelings. You seem sad your mommy stepped out. Shall I hold you? She'll be back very soon. You can keep an eye on that door if you need to. I'll watch with you. One of my favorite moments in teaching parent-infant classes at Rye was when a mother comforted her crying toddler in her arms, and the mother just said, I'm listening. I'm listening," while her daughter cried it out. There are many lessons here about mental health and wellness, and Magda built it right into the classes and made it accessible. I remember being an intern at a parent-infant class, and a mother came for a visit with her baby. The mother was very anxious. She followed the child. She told her not to fall many times, and basically helicoptered over her. And as a young Rise zealot, I was horrified. And after the class, I said to Magda, "How can we help this baby?" I didn't care at all what happened to that mother, but I was worried about the baby. And Magda said, "She will not be back." She said, "That kind of anxiety is very deep, and I do not think Rai was for her." And of course, Magda was right. We never heard from that mother again. And Magda used to say, "Rai is not for everyone." And I used to think, "Oh, yes, it is. We can teach them. I know we can." But over the years, I've come to believe her, that Rai is for people who want Rai. And it is no longer Rai. If we force feed someone, it becomes something else entirely. She taught us to observe in a very special way. And so when we're talking about attuning to babies, she taught us to pay attention in this very special way, which she called object-free observation. She used to ask adults to pretend we knew nothing about the baby. She would ask you to clear your mind, pretend the baby was an alien just landed from another planet, and you know absolutely nothing, and you are watching to learn. She called this object-free observation. We're not observing with a particular objective. Object-free does not mean emotion-free. And you can see pleasure in this mother's face as she watches her beautiful son. We don't have to be somber to be respectful. For those of you in the infant family field, you know that it's a pretty unique viewpoint on observation. As child development students, we're often sent out to observe with checklists, running records, time samplings, developmental profile forms, and we're going to learn how that child fits into a particular system, stage, age, or behavior profile. Does that sound familiar? For those of you who've been students. So this is a very different way of looking at babies, and it's a message that really needs to get into child development classes. So instead she said, just watch. And in the format she developed for parent-infant guidance classes, she always included, and this still occurs, as many of you know, 20 minutes of silent observation to allow for this experience. And these observation periods, which occur in every class, have a sense of being sacred times. Infants seem to blossom during this time. But it's not easy to do, to let go of agendas, concerns, outside issues encroach in your mind. It's something that takes practice and practice and practice, and it is so worth the effort. And I believe when we make the effort and we learn how to really see children in front of us, that the experience can transform us. And it's a form of meditation. So I wanted to share with you a book, a little bit about this book, Silas Marner. Has anybody read this book? It's by George Eliot, and it was originally published in 1861, and she had been recommended to me, and she was a woman who had to write under a man's name to get her book out there. And she wrote this huge, fat book called Middlemarch, which I wanted to read, but then when I saw how big it was, I got scared, and then this little one was sitting next to it. So I bought it, and I read the little one. And then I was so struck by how much it related to my work and my interest and my passion. So I wanted to share a little bit with you about it. And so the story is that Silas Marner is a weaver, and he lives out in the woods in this village called Raveloe, and he is isolated and alone. He is cataleptic, so he has these periods of blankness where he just goes blank, and he doesn't know what happens. He doesn't remember anything, and so people are afraid of him. They don't know if he's possessed or what his deal is, and so he's very alone. His name, Silas, means in the woods or forest. But he is a very talented weaver, and he is very successful as a weaver. The women bring him business even though they don't want to talk to him, and he starts to amass this pile of gold. And he becomes obsessed with his gold, not for what it can buy, but because it's so beautiful. And he keeps it under his floorboards, and at night he peels back the floorboards and he gazes at his glowing, beautiful gold, and he touches it. And before long, his gold is stolen, and he is bereft, and he goes in search of his gold. And instead, he finds a child whose mother has died in the cold. And this little one toddles into his life, and he gazes at her in wonderment. At first, he thinks that her golden curls are his gold returned to him because her hair is glowing. So he begins to experience joy and connection with this child. He has no expectations of her whatsoever. He's amazed by every sound and movement she makes. He gazes at her. He calls her Epi, after a sound she makes when she babbles. I looked up Epi, and it means upon, near, or on. And I think her name sort of represents the present, that she draws him, Silas, out of the woods and into the present. And she glows and she giggles. And so she's trying, when he first finds her, she's tugging at her boots and she's whimpering. And so he helps her take the boots off, and this is what happens. The baby was at once happily occupied with the primary mystery of her own toes, inviting Silas with much chuckling to consider the mystery too. He starts to become attuned to her rhythms, her communications, and her interests, and he becomes amazed by toes for perhaps the first time in his life. And through his caring for her, he begins to connect with the women in the village who start to bring him things for the baby. His whole life is transformed, and he becomes connected to his community. But his primary connection is with Epi, and she attaches to him and is recovering from the loss of her mother. And I feel like this story is a wonderful parable that fits so nicely with Magda's notion of object-free observation, because Silas was object-free. He was disconnected, and he had no expectations. So, while we have the chance through this process of observation to be with the baby, provide for the baby, and help the baby see herself through our benevolent gaze, we also have the opportunity to be transformed as Silas Marner was, to become more connected, to feel more alive, and maybe a little more hopeful about the world. So I think sometimes when we have this realization that our kids can find a particular grain of sand on a sandy beach, or hear tones that we cannot hear, that we can become overwhelmed. This amazing person may one day change the world. How can I best prepare her for this massive responsibility? What if I mess up her instincts? What if I don't give her enough opportunities? What if I miss something? Am I squashing her? Expecting too much? How do I know when to help and when to wait? And as a parent of a school-age child, when to push and when to protect? Will my son be a composer because he notices the different sounds when his cup taps 2 different plates or hums the tones of an engine? Perhaps. Let them be who they are, even if they're sort of mediocre. You know what I mean. So, I was recently told by a well-meaning relative that my child is so bright that he may well write a best-selling novel by the age of 15. What if he doesn't? He's finally reading at the 3rd grade level in 3rd grade. Does anybody have a child that they are thrilled to have working at grade level? Right? Yay for children working at grade level. So this was a very well-meaning statement that, my friend was saying she has faith in my child, but it made me very uncomfortable because I don't think he needs to be extraordinary to be okay. And I just want him to be who he is. And this is who he is. This is my little St. Francis boy right here. And what if they have special needs or a disability? What if they have more than one? What if she's like me? What if she's not? If we're going to have reasonable expectations for our children, we have to start with ourselves. So my New Year's resolution for the last 2 years has been to lower the bar and to expect less of myself and to be okay with it. And it's the only New Year's resolution I've ever kept. And I'm offering it to you. So if you want to use it this year, it's the easiest one ever to keep. In the RIE manual, Magda gave us some really sage advice on this. So this is from page 17 of the manual. When you give yourself the same respect you give your children, that teaches the children respect for you also. Sacrificing your own needs for the child's only creates inward anger with both of you. If it is important that you must finish reading the newspaper before you play with your little person, then clearly convey that message. Let the child know what it is you want to do for yourself and what you expect the child to do, so that playing quietly while you read can later grow into hours of secure separateness. Both of you doing something independent of the other and still feeling good about your relationship. So finally, what does this all mean for the children? What are the rewards of this kind of approach? We get a lot out of it, but what do they get? And they get so much that I couldn't possibly cover all of it right now, and I think you know that, and I think that's why you're here. But just a couple of highlights from my perspective. I think they continue to develop this profound awareness with which they are born. And let's look at just a few seconds of a video that's probably very familiar to many of you from the RIE video, See How They Move. This is my favorite clip from RIE video. So I'm going to play it, and then I'm going to describe to you what makes this a uniquely RIE moment. So Magda's talking about falling, but we're just watching these two here and how they handle the equipment and each other.
Learning to fall, getting up again, and moving on is the best preparation for life.
So you see the very relaxed grown-up leaning on the fence over there watching, totally trusting these babies. These are some of the elements that are contained in this situation. The babies have been trusted to solve problems, and they're trusting themselves. And the fact that the adult is willing to stand back and not give them rules or direction is a way of communicating trust. The fact that she's not doing anything is communicating her trust because she's watching. They know she's present. The equipment is absolutely developmentally appropriate. If someone did fall, they're not going to go very far. The adults observing know the children well. So if one of these children was a biter or a grabber or likely to push, someone would probably be a lot closer than they are. They're given time to solve the problem, which Magda always advised. They're allowed to have equipment on the ramp. They're allowed to hold things while they're climbing, which is something that is often a rule, especially in a childcare setting, that's not allowed. And finally, there are no rules about how to use the ramp. There's no rule about one person at a time. There's no rule about which direction you can go. They're allowed to. There's nobody coming in saying, you guys are way too close to each other. Someone's going to fall and get hurt. Instead, the adults are sitting back and watching. And so part of what's happening here in a parent-infant guidance class is likely a facilitator is able to say to the parents, let's notice how amazingly these children are negotiating this situation. And they don't even seem to look at each other. So it's not a negotiation in like who's going to get what. They just manage the situation so beautifully. I love that scene, and I think it's very deep. So just one last little story. I was thinking about, what makes all of it worth it. And so I just wanted to tell you one thing that my child told me at 21 months. So at 21 months, this happened. On a road trip in a hotel room, Halcyon was lolling in her portacrib, talking about her day, which had included about 3 hours in the car, an unusual occurrence in her short life. In the car, we had been singing lots of songs, doing finger plays, and even had lollipops, mother's little helper. As she was lying in her little bed talking about the day to herself, she repeated a rhyme we had been singing in the car. She said, "This little piggy go market, this piggy market, this piggy market, this little piggy has enough, this piggy has enough." If you're familiar with the nursery rhyme, you know that the fourth little piggy had none, which is very far from enough. And my little child's ramblings in that moment caused my heart, like the Grinch's, to swell from 2 sizes too small to almost bursting. I felt that my own child could not imagine a little piggy having none. In her life, I hope she has had her needs met, her wishes acknowledged, and her choices honored. And yes, I probably read too much into it. But if she were a little piggy, she would truly have enough, which to me is a great relief. As an infant, she was a very demanding child. She required almost all of me, almost all of the time. Anyone know any babies like that? And here she was telling my heart that this little piggy has enough. Her little piggy bucket feels full. I felt warm and fuzzy for days. Once in a while, we must pat ourselves or each other on the backs and remind ourselves that our little piggies do have enough. And sometimes the little piggies remind us, if we listen closely in the night. One final thought, a special moment with Magda. This photo is courtesy of the Gerber family. With all of her wisdom about babies, Magda was aware that their inner workings are a mystery. So in a parent-infant class, a baby about 9 months old watched her and finally crawled over and pulled up on her knees and looked up in her eyes. And she gazed. They held each other's gaze for a long time. And she looked into his eyes and she said, "A penny for your thoughts, 2 pennies." Thank you. So I sort of went over, but we might have time for a few questions or comments if anybody has them. And I have one little comment, which is I am well aware that not all of our little piggies have enough. And I do think that that's why we're here, that we're learning more and more about helping them have enough.